Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming to this presentation. Um, First of all, as you have seen from the draft of this presentation, this topic is related to REST API documentation. We will talk about Spring REST docs, which will be enhanced with RAML. During this presentation, I will just briefly describe RAML and include a slide demo that will show you the basics of this approach. So my name is Matea. I'm working as a software engineer in Asseco. We are a company that is in the fintech industry, and we're dealing with services all the time. Our backend services were mainly developed using SOAP approach in the past, but for some time now we are using REST APIs. And during that development, we somehow realized that the documentation is a crucial part of our development, not only for our services, but also for the services we are connecting to. For example, we were having a lot of issues when connecting to other companies' endpoints when they were not well documented, and we just tried to improve our process, our documentation, so the other companies won't experience such issues. So I will just briefly introduce you to this topic. This is the overview. First, I will talk about the documentation and its importance, why it matters so much in developing services. Then I will show you some approaches in documenting REST APIs in Java. The next few bullets relate to Spring REST docs and RAML, basically RAML support for Spring REST docs. And how it enhanced now the Spring REST docs things. So I will just show you the handy tools that can be used and that will improve your process. So let's start. When we were developing our services, we realized that there are some fields that can be documented that are really important for our customers and our clients to be good described. So it doesn't matter if we are the company that is connecting to the other company's endpoint, or we are talking about another developer that is included in a project and he has to be acquainted with the service. That documentation part is a crucial part, because if you just give a documentation that is not accurate, that doesn't describe the state of that service at that moment, that will have a big impact on your company's business, on your clients, and on your partners. So outdated documentation really has a big impact on your business, and as we all know, the developers, well, they don't like writing documentation. It is probably the most tedious part of our development process, and when we get a task that we have to maintain some documentation, it doesn't just, it isn't really good for us to do. So there are some generators in Java that can help us in this process. Like I've listed 3 of them. Swagger is probably the most common one. A lot of people use it. It is a complete framework for describing, producing, consuming, and visualizing RESTful web services, and it is free to use. It is a good tool, but this is not really beneficial for us. We wanted something else, and that else was found in a combination of the other 2. So there is a combination of RAML and Spring REST docs that met our needs. So RAML is also free to use. It is not a generator. It is a format of some documentation that can be used with several tools, and then it can be consumed by other platforms to just parse and display information. And when it is combined with Spring REST docs, you get just what you need. Why? Because Spring REST Docs has a TDD approach. So you cannot get the documentation if you do not have a test. So it basically forces you to write tests for your services, and then if test fails, you won't have a documentation. And if you won't have a documentation, you won't have a release. So it will just force you to maintain your documentation, and it will generate documentation that is both accurate and readable. So this is something that I found when I was just searching through internet. There was a company in Germany, ePages, that developed this RAML support. But first of all, I would like to introduce you to Spring REST Docs. It uses test-driven approach. So as I've already mentioned, you are obliged to write tests, and those tests will generate snippets. They will be combined with handwritten documentation in a form of ASCII doctor, and then it will generate a document that you can transform, for example, to HTML or whatever you need. It is really important to have a really good description of resources, and I will just show all of this in a demo later on. And if you use this Spring REST Docs, you will get documentation that is accurate, concise, and well-structured, because at every moment of time, you will get a documentation that will accurately describe the current state of your API. So why do we need something else if Spring REST Docs is already good enough? Well, if we think about it, we will have, for example, resources and fields for our resources that are described in our code. But most of us have some tech writers or, I don't know, business analysts that are obliged to keep that strings in a form that can be, for example, publicly announced. We use, for example, in our tests, many funny words and things that cannot be just published on a public website. And this is how a tech writer can keep it in just one document, in one file, and that file can be used in our API. It can be just placed in a resources folder. It needs to be mapped, so a developer has to use that file with those keywords, and then those keywords will be used in generation of documentation. It is also important because in our development process we can use several microservices. So we won't have a documentation that will document each resource, each microservice by itself, but it will produce a joint documentation where all resources will be described. And therefore, a client won't see the architecture, and he shouldn't see the architecture of our product, and that it is consisted of several microservices. So what is RAML? RAML is a RESTful API modeling language. It is now really in good use by many developers because it is a machine-readable API that is human-friendly. So when you see a RAML, it is really important to understand the service API from its description. And there are many different tools for RAML. So you can use, for example, from MuleSoft NPM in order to just transform RAML to HTML, and there are also, for example, API console where you can get a live demo of your service just from that documentation. And those handy tools are widely, they can be used, and there is no license, so you just need to install them and use them. There is also API Matic. This is a tool that can be used, for example, when you want to transform your documentation in many formats. For example, you can use it to transform it to Postman, and then you just import that zip with tests in Postman, and you can test it right away. So we can proceed to the demo where you can see how it looks like. Okay, I prepared a sample application. It is a very simple application where there are only two resources. There is a flight resource that has only two properties. I don't know if you see it well. It uses properties name and price, like you need to describe the name of the flight and the price, and those are the properties that should be in a documentation. And when we see travel plan, it has a list of flights and also a Boolean property ordered, which means is that flight travel plan already booked or not. And then we also can explain a little bit controller for travel plan. You can see that there are two repositories. One is for travel plan and the other one for a flight repository that needs to be auto-wired. And then there are several methods, for example, for creation of travel plan, also for getting a travel plan by travel plan ID, and for ordering travel plan. And then we get to the tests. The tests are in a separate folder. We should first start with the base integration test. This is where we set up the whole project for testing. You can see that I'm using mock MVC, but you can use several other testing frameworks. It supports several of them, and then you need to set up some payload. For example, I've defined flight Zagreb to Vienna, which costs, for example, 150 euros. And then there are several payload methods that are just setting up the project, and those methods should be used in integration tests. You should write two integration tests if you have two resources. For example, if you want to test a flight resource, then you should have a flight integration test. And the test looks like this. First of all, the part with documentation is this part. It has a static method document which needs to be imported from ePages project. This is a RAML-based string ResDocs API that says, okay, I'm going to document flight get method, and the response fields should be name and the price. And here you can see this will be the description of the name. So in documentation you expect to see a property name and the price on the flight. And those response fields are not only the response fields, they are also an assertion. So this means that if you forgot to, for example, attest or include some property from the resource, then it will fail. It will say that you missed some property, and if you, for example, misspelled something, it will fail for two reasons. Because you've used some property that you haven't described in your resource, and you haven't described the resource that you were to describe. And then you should know also that if you want to test it, you have to have an ASCII-doc files. This is the part that I've already mentioned. That will be the handwritten documentation. It needs to be placed in Documents folder, and here you can see there are three files. The first is flight ADoc. This is an ASCII-doctor document for flight resources. This is for description of methods for flight. For example, if you take a look at this first one, it is for creating flights. So this is just a header, and after that we can use the macro operation, which says, okay, for flights create, you should incorporate all the snippets for that method, including HTTP request, HTTP response, and request fields. So when we're testing it, it will generate snippets, and in a RAML-doc file, we will see the documentation for flights create. So when we want to include ASCII-doctors files into one joint file, we need to include it like this. There should be an index ADoc file where we specify, okay, we need to include flights ADoc and also travel plan ADoc. After that, we are ready to start with testing. So we should just start with Gradle test, and you'll get build. build folder with generated snippets. Those snippets will look like this. So for flight get, you'll get a separate directory with all generated parts. This is really beneficial because, as you can see, you'll also get a CURL request. So there is no ambiguity in a form how you'll test it. It will generate the right endpoint and the right flags. It will also result in flight get response JSON, where you'll see how this JSON looks like. So this is the response that you expect, and also this will be the schema for that response. And after all of that, you'll also get a RAML file. So you can take a look at this RAML file. It describes flights that can be get by flight ID. So you see that it is related to get method, and the description of it is that it should return a response with the status code 200, and the body is an application HEL or JSON. It also says which JSON files should be included. So after all of this, we should also have a RAML doc file, a file that will just represent the whole project. That will be this file, API RAML. It will be a joint file of flights RAML and also of travel plans RAML. So we won't get, we will get those separate files, but we will also get one file with all descriptions of all microservices that are included. And when we got that RAML file, this is not documentation in a form that we are accustomed to use, so we can also transform it. We are accustomed to HTML, so we can use those handy tools that I've already mentioned. One of them is RAML to HTML. This will convert API RAML to some form of HTML document, and then it will show it in a form that it is common to all of us. So you just need to install it from npm package and just position yourself into build folder. And it should produce an HTML file. That file can be seen right here. So we can try to open it. So here you can see all the resources. It also displays the address that we expect this service to be served on. There is also flights resource and travel plans resource. So if we take a look, for example, to flights ID, we can just click on this get, and we'll see that an ID is required, and it needs to be sent in endpoint call, and the response looks like this. So you can take a look how it, what is required and what should be returned. But what is also important to say is that when we test methods, some of them return several status codes. For example, you can test for some method, for example, in this flights ID, if you use post method, you can also post a price that is negative. So you expect this method to fail. You won't return a status code 200, but you will return, for example, 400 or stuff like that. So you will need to write two tests for those two cases, but when you generate a documentation, it will return a joint documentation, and it will be in this form of patch. For example, if you look at this response, here is the status code 200 when, for example, someone tried to post, write price that is positive, and you can see it is Zagreb, Vienna, and 100, but you can also return an HTTP status code 400, where you expect this code to be returned when someone, for example, returned minus 108 euros, and there is also a message must be greater than 0. This is something that you also need to set in your tests. And after all of that, it is really important for us to just make our clients happy in a form that they can test it. So we are able to get them to just give them this API documentation, and we can just zip it, and then they can use it, for example, in Postman and test that service live. So for example, we need to just create that API zip folder. And we should get an API zip. So this is a zip folder. And then we can use API Matic tool that I've already mentioned in order to convert it into Postman file, so you can just import it. I'm not connected to internet right now, so just a moment. But I do have this file, so you just need to set this zip file to API Matic tool, and it will result in something like this, a JSON file that you can just include in Postman. It will import all those tests that you are to use. For example, you can try to add a flight or to post something to get flight with ID. So I will show you now. Okay. You just need to click to this import and then choose a file. This is this file that API Matic generates. So it has already 8 requests, and there is no need for you to write your tests. And then we can just try to, for example, post something. But before that, you need to start your service. You just write boot run in order to run it. You can see that Tomcat started on port 8080, so you are set. You set everything, and you can just try to post something, for example. And here you see, we tried to post some flight. We use default, for example, post the next one, and this is flight with index 1 because we haven't posted anything. And then we can just try to get flight by ID. Now we need to just set this ID as 1 because we've added it now. And then you get this flight. You can use this for any kind of service as long as it is developed with Spring. And it comes very handy for your clients as well because they can test it from documentation. So thank you. If you have any questions, please free to ask.